Well, Dan Wild, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Oh, it's great for you to join us. Hey, people will know you from Sky News and with your role at the Institute of Public Affairs. They may not know that at the last federal election, you're also a candidate for a South Australian federal seat. Um, Maybe first of all, describe that seat. What's it like for people who are unfamiliar with that part of Adelaide?
Yeah, sure. I mean, firstly, thanks for having me on, and thank you for doing this as well. I think these kind of discussions are really, really important, and I think the more voices we have in the debate in Australia, particularly on the centre right, the better off we're going to be. So we might get into a bit of that as we go along. Yeah, so I had a crack at politics for the Liberal Party. I was the Liberal candidate for the seat of Spence, which is in
Spence.
the outer northern suburbs. Yeah, Spence, outer northern suburbs of Adelaide. It's centred around Elizabeth, which is was the home of Holden's, where they manufactured Holden's there, and other manufacturing plants like Levi's and so forth. So it was really sort of the manufacturing industrial powerhouse of South Australia for many, many years. And of course, sadly, many of those facilities have shut up, and shut down for many, many years ago. And then it goes all the way up to Gawler, which is basically a regional town, although it's had a lot of urban development take place. And then there's a lot of growth suburbs, Anglevale, Blakeview being two examples of a very rapid housing development. And so it's a fairly diverse electorate in the sense of you've got the older working class element that is centred around Elizabeth and Salisbury. You've got sort of young professional families moving into those growth suburbs, and you've got a semi-regional feel to parts of it as well. So, yeah, real mix of people. It has been a safe Labor seat. It was on about a 12% margin. That margin's gone out now to about 14% after the last election. But yeah, basically wanted to give it a crack, and it was a great experience.
And that seat would have voted no in the voice referendum. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly did. Yeah. It was a 72% no vote, which
Right.
was the biggest no vote in a Labor seat in the country.
Yeah, right. Wow. So in theory, at least, then this should have been one of these outer city seats that were ripe for being taken by the conservative side in the same way that Trump took the Rust Belt states in the US and Boris Johnson took the Red Wall states in the UK. Why do you think it wasn't a repeat of that at the last federal election?
Yeah, well, you're bang on in terms of this is the exact kind of seat that the centre right should be winning. That was one of the reasons I wanted to put my hand up for that seat. And a couple of things. Whilst we did lose, we had the smallest swing against us in South Australia. And we also achieved swings in 16 out of 45 booths. And all of those swings were around Elizabeth, Salisbury, and Manopara, which are those typically lower income working class areas. And I did run very much as far as I could. Obviously, being a part of the Liberal Party, I very happily respected the policy platform and communicated that to the public. But I also made it clear what my values are as an individual, and I talked a lot about values and culture. The Australian flag, Australia Day, the voice to Parliament, and so forth. And so I think the community was receptive to that. But the broader point you make is a good one, which is, we lost and we went backwards, not only in Spence, but in many other outer suburban electorates. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, the Liberal brand, insofar as it has one, is perceived as being the party of the wealthy and big business. Now, that might be an unfair characterisation, and maybe that was true in the past, but that is the perception that people have of the Liberal Party. They still believe the Labor Party is the party of workers, and they still believe the Greens are the party of the environment. So these sort of brands, if you like, are very sticky. Now, we know that the Greens don't care about the environment. They're woke, radical activists, and Labor is the party of the elites now more so than workers. Like those of us who, I guess, follow politics closely can see this, but to the puncher on the street, that's just not the case. So there's that. The other point is our policy offerings were not particularly good. And to the extent that we had good policies, they were announced very late in the campaign, and they lacked any capacity to communicate them to the public. I'll give you an example, which was cutting the fuel excise. Good policy, in my opinion. Not nearly enough in terms of fixing the country, but for a community like the one I was seeking to represent, it's the highest car use community in a suburban electorate in the country because there's not a lot of public transport in the outer northern suburbs. Over 50% are two-car households. Over 70% drive their car to work. So these are the people that will benefit the most. Now, I have a job as a local candidate to communicate it, but there's only so much you can do by yourself. And unfortunately, on voting day, a lot of people didn't know about the policy, and a lot of people didn't know how they'd benefit from it. So there was a failure there. And look, I think more broadly, my main takeaway as a candidate is the absolute critical need for authenticity. People can tell when you're not being authentic with them. It's not so much what you believe or what you don't believe, but provided that you're being honest with people about what it is that you think, and you sort of bring them on a journey with you, most people will respect that. As a party, we haven't done that. I mean, take net zero as an example. I mean, no one believes net zero is a good idea. Even in the Liberal Party, no one really believes it. Who goes out there and passionately argues for net zero? Like, absolutely no one. Like, yes, there's people that give lip service and they're sort of, they have an epiphany for, the renewables, but no one passionately says, yeah, net zero is really the thing our country needs to fix it. So, yeah, I guess those are some of the takeaways there.
Yeah. So why how do you explain then the fact that, parties like the Republican Party and the Conservatives in the UK, who I guess traditionally were also seen of the party of the rich, although that's not a fair characterization either, but they were able to successfully rebrand, and Australia wasn't. In Australia, it wasn't the case. I mean, it is, especially when it did seem so promising when you had those outer city seats vote for, you know, vote strongly against the voice. I mean, that's the problem to be solved, right?
Yeah, exactly right. So it came down to Trump, and it came down to his basically hostile takeover of the Republican Party, because they have an open primaries, non-compulsory voting in the primaries. He was able to become the leader. There's no way he could have done what he did in the US in a system like Australia because we have a parliamentary system. So the hostile takeover by Trump, and his, I guess, almost 100% name recognition. It's just, no one has the name recognition that Trump has. So when he speaks, people listen. So there were unique factors in the US. I think in the UK, it was also driven by Boris Johnson, who then subsequently totally bottled it when he became prime minister. But don't forget Nigel Farage. I mean, really, Nigel Farage has been the driving force of all of this. Brexit wouldn't have happened without Nigel. And he did it with UKIP, and then he did it with the Brexit Party, and now he's got his own party, Reform, who by the polling is at the top. Now there's 4 years to go to the next election there, so the polls don't mean much. But the reality is that I think those factors played a role that aren't prevalent in Australia. And don't forget, in Australia we've also got preferential voting. So that changes the dynamic. I mean, both Labor and Liberal, they've only got about 3 in 10 Australians voting for them at the moment. So yes, Labor won by a lot, but it wasn't sort of an enthusiastic endorsement of Labor's agenda.
Mm. So that's it, part of Adelaide, Elizabeth, which was as you say, the place which was car manufacturer, heavy industrial, public Australia, and is now no longer that really, or no longer that to the same extent it was. I mean, the National Conservative stuff globally, one of the major points is a reassessment of trade policy, and Trump has caused a fundamental change in the Republican Party on trade policy. But there's been no real, as far as I can discern, change in the bipartisan consensus here. Both the parties think that we should continue to have 100% manufactured goods come in from China duty-free. What do you think? You're ex-Treasury. I mean, trade policy can be done well and can be done poorly, but isn't the current system a bit crazy?
Yeah, I don't think the current system's working well, and it's not working in the way it used to. Just as a minor thing, I wasn't at Treasury, I was at Prime Minister and Cabinet Department, but I did economics work there, just in case anyone thinks I'm misrepresenting myself. I'm sure someone will pick something up and say I'm lying or something like that. So, but no, I did do some work on economic policy there. Look, my view throughout most of my, I guess, formative years, I studied economics at uni. And in my early days working, I was very much, a free trader, very much in of the view that this sort of global rules-based liberalism was a good thing and it was a necessary thing. And I think that was basically the standard thinking at the time. Now, there's good reasons for that. I mean, basically having a free market system is the best way of generating wealth. Through basically efficiently allocating resources around the world. So yes, the world as a whole will get wealthier as a result of a freer trading system, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily fair, and that doesn't also take into account local economic effects or local social effects that flow from those economic effects, which is one of the limitations of a singular focus on a free trading system. I think in Australia, broadly speaking, the free trade system worked pretty well from 1970, mid 70s, when Whitlam first started cutting tariffs through to probably 2001, which is when China entered the World Trade Organization. And I think since then, broadly speaking, it has not served our interests in the way that it once did. So I think we do need to have a reevaluation of trade policy. I'm not convinced necessarily that tariffs are the right thing. And the reason for that is because it creates incentives for intense government lobbying and rent seeking, because everyone's going to go to the government seeking protection. So that's one of the reasons I don't. It's not so much the economic efficiency of it. I'm not that fussed as much by that component. It's more so the political incentives of business, and it sets up an incentive for corporatism to take place as well. So I worry about that, but I do share your broad perspective that the current system is not the system that's working well. And what I think at a minimum we need to be doing on the centre right is at least have a debate about whether we want to keep doing what we're doing as a country.
Yeah, because I feel like on the centre right in Australia, there's this idea that, look, we would reindustrialize if we just got rid of net zero and had really cheap energy, and that would be in itself sufficient. And I keep saying to these people, look, Ohio has nuclear energy. Ohio has a much more flexible labor market than we could probably ever hope for. Ohio has cheaper overall taxation, and still, all the factories left there and went to China. So d- don't we kind of have to at some point, I mean, grasp the nettle and say, you know, we have close trading relationships with countries that are more like us. Um, obviously we have a free trade zone in Australia itself, but from Townsville to Tarcoola, no tariffs, fine. But between countries that are very different politically and socially, you have to be very careful, and you can't approach it with this doctrinaire type of view that, zero zero tariffs on goods from those countries is just some sort of principle that can never be, um, you know, fact checked or sort of like approached with a more realist view. I just find there's this difficulty of getting through to people that the world is, it matters who you're trading with, not just that you're trading, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think that the economics, if you like, of trade needs to be viewed within the context of culture and politics as well. And so, if you take a country like China as an example, China doesn't have a reciprocal free trade system. It doesn't follow the same rules that everybody else follows, and it's also potentially a very hostile adversary as well. So, does it make sense for Australia's trade policies, in effect, to be making China wealthier? You know, that's a debate we should have, because why would you make a potential enemy stronger? Which is one of the effects of what we're doing. I think the other point is, on the centre right, we need to also remember that we live not just in an economy, but we live in a society. And the reality is that we have sometimes focused too much on the economics. And, in the context of what you're getting at, I think we need to explain, well, why do we care about manufacturing? Right? Because there's a good question, which is, who cares? Like, why, those days are gone. We don't have the horse and buggy anymore. We don't have this, agriculture has categorically changed when, 200 years ago, a majority of people, or a significant share of people, used to work in agriculture, but they don't anymore, but we still get fed. Whatever it was 50 years ago, a significant share worked in manufacturing. We don't, but people still have jobs, we still have cars, we still have things. So does it actually matter? And I think the answer is it does matter. And one of the things I saw in the community that I was seeking to represent was a lot of people who are low skilled or don't have really any marketable skills. A significant share had left school before year 12. Only a very small percentage had completed university. And I don't think our modern economy is set up to cater for people that are in the lower skilled category. To give them a well-paid, stable job where they can make a contribution. A lot of the jobs that are available to low or no skilled workers are typically pretty precarious jobs, sort of casual jobs. And casual jobs have a very important role to play because some people want them for flexibility and they might be studying or have carer responsibilities. So I'm not knocking those jobs at all. But, one of the things is we talk a lot about apprenticeships, and apprenticeships are very good things. And I think that we should support more people getting into apprenticeships. But an interesting thing that I learnt that I wasn't aware of before I was a candidate is because typically apprenticeships are pretty low paid to start with, and you've still got to work full time. A lot of people who have children or who have carers responsibilities can't have that low of a wage, and they also probably can't commit to a long-term proposition like that. So there's actually not a lot of options for those who, for various reasons, can't get into a qualified trade. Back in the day, working at a factory was one of those options that they had. And I don't think that option has been replaced in our modern society. And I think that's creating a problem, particularly with young men, the sort of increase in joblessness among young men. And there's a lot of social problems, crime, dysfunction. When the jobs go out, the drugs come in and the dysfunction comes in. So that's my argument, is more of a cultural argument as to why we need to have manufacturing. I don't think that we should ever seek to have, to go back to the past. We're not going to, GMs is not coming back in the way it used to, or the things that we used to make are not going to come back in the same way. But there is a very strong moral and cultural reason why we need to have these options available for people.
Yeah, I mean, I've only been to Adelaide once, so I'm speaking as a complete novice, really. But it used to be somewhat like the Chicago of Australia. A hub which connected the west coast to the east coast with a big manufacturing center. And now what? I mean, it doesn't have that industrial base. It has its growth industries are defense. I mean, the NDIS, agriculture, and then some very niche type of service industries and the like. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, I think tourism, like a lot of states, the service base, so tourism and international students, right? And I don't have anything against either of those sectors, but, they're not powerhouse sectors, right? So yes, there's a role for international students, sure, but I just think it's gotten to the point where it has become so focused on the bottom line of universities and sort of filling the coffers of vice chancellors, in addition to putting all of this pressure on social services and public transport, that it's clearly gone way out of whack. I mean, one of the things in South Australia is also the state government here is quite clever in the sense of it really is a bread and circuses government. We've got lots of events, we've got the golf, we've got the cars, we've got the footy, and I like all of those things, right? I'm quite happy to have those things, and there's an argument that government should help underwrite some community events. And yes, okay, maybe it brings in some tourists and maybe you get some benefit to the economy, but you can't run an economy on events. So you're quite right. The gap that was left from, I guess, the heyday of manufacturing and industry hasn't been filled, other than defence, which does provide a lot of pretty good employment. But again, that's government funded, so taxpayers are paying for it. In terms of like private sector, sustainable private sector jobs that are generating real economic value over a sustained period of time, there's not a stack of it, sadly, at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, so how has it turned around? Because it's I've if in political terms, if nothing else, it's destroyed the Liberal Party stronghold in South Australia. So destroying when there was a manufacturing industry, where there wasn't much more broad-based middle class economy, the Liberal Party thrived. Now it's become like a lot of Australia, reliant on tourism and international students, and I guess resources and property, and politically that's been terrible for the party which was meant to represent the middle class, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the middle class is being destroyed. Really, when you look at it, you can see this in the data, but also just anecdotally, you can see that you've got this sort of. I mean, Joel Kotkin, who you're probably aware of, has talked about this a lot. He's one of the leading demographers in the US, and we brought him out a couple of years ago with the IPA. He did a study of the Australian situation, and but basically his assessment of this new sort of serfdom that's developing, and this new sort of underclass of, I mean, people are compared to the Russian serfs, we're way, 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 way better off than them. But people just don't own things anymore. Young, homes, but also cars, even music. People don't buy music; they, get us, Spotify and stream it, and that's perfectly fine. But I'm just making the point that people don't own things in the way that they used to, and so therefore you don't have a stake. If you don't own something, you don't really have a stake in caring for it, which is sort of the Menzian conception of home ownership, that you own a home, you care for it, you're embedded in your community, you send your kids to the local school, you're going to pay attention to what's happening, and you're going to become more of an active citizen, which is actually what democracy isn't just voting every 3 years, it's citizens being involved in what's happening in their community. So you've got this growing sort of underclass, and then you've got the middle class, which is getting squeezed. So a lot of people in the middle class who are sort of embedded largely in the private economy are trying to get out of it by jumping into these either safe corporate jobs or into the ever-growing public sector, because they're seeking safety and economic stability. So you've got a collapsing, basically, middle class and a growing sort of oligarchy at the top and a growing underclass at the bottom. And yeah, politically, you're right. The middle class has been, I mean, I think sometimes, the forgotten people thing is a bit overdone, but I think it is quite true that people in the middle class who are battling away, working, dealing with their kids, dealing with local issues, whatever, they're not organised, they're not wealthy, they're not powerful. They have been the base of the centre right for very good reason. But to be honest, the centre right hasn't done much for them, right? Over the last, what have we done to support middle class prosperity? So, yeah, I think your assessment is correct that in political terms, that constituency is shrinking, and it's not necessarily going to stay Liberal either.
Do you think that these issues are new? Because I feel like on the centre right in Australia, everyone describes themselves as a classical liberal, which is effectively like a Gladstonian liberal. The IPA, the CIS, Robert Menzies Institute, pretty much every columnist in the broadsheets would just have described themselves in those terms, and yet a Benjamin Disraeli didn't describe himself in those terms. I don't believe a Menzies really did either, or an Alfred Deakin. They were much more focused on nation building and the policies that were required to sustain and build a middle class, rather than simply trying to work out which policies would most align with a bundle of liberal axioms. And I feel like that kind of like practical knowledge on the right about what is actually necessary to build and sustain nations has sort of been lost. We're all Gladstonian liberals now. That's what we all turn back to. And that whole tradition of, like I said, Disraeli, but also the Republicans, Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, all those guys were in favor of, trade from tariffs and a much more kind of nation-first foreign policy, and a much more kind of cautious approach to making sure that immigration works for their nation too. I just feel like all that tradition and that school of thought has been passed away. I mean, even at the IPA, I had a chat with John Roscombe on this podcast, and the IPA used to have no issues with tariffs really, but it wanted to make sure that the banks weren't nationalised. But it was of the view that that made sense within in order to build Australia. Do you see what I'm getting at? There is a sort of intellectual gap there, which probably is where some of the solutions for the right, will be found.
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from. I sort of think economic nationalism is something that has been in the ascendancy over the last decade. Certainly in the US, on continental Europe, probably in the UK to an extent, although probably not so much. There's not. I mean, one of the challenges with Australia is we don't have a stack of intellectuals on the centre right. We don't have a stack of people who can sort of sit there and actually nut this out and write things and influence things. In America, there's like thousands of them around. So
Yeah.
it's a very rich and diverse intellectual environment. I really enjoyed the debate that took place in the US around 2015 when you had this real proper debate on the centre right about, okay, do we want to keep going down this road or not? And, this is why I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing. And I hope that you can get a bigger profile because these debates are important. I agree with you about a lot of that. I mean, certainly in the 40s and 50s, the talk that we had. I mean, you can look at the I guess the centerpiece document that sort of set the IPA up, which was called
Mm.
Looking Forward. That was really about a mixed economy. Was the language that was used there. This was kind of before. I mean, Keynes was kind of in the ascendancy economically. Hayek was around, but hadn't quite. Milton Friedman kind of popularized a lot of Hayek theories, and that was sort of in the sort of 70s when that took off. So in the 40s and 50s, the thinking was still around a mixed economy. So if you go through that document, you won't see you see a lot of references to individual freedom, constitutional democracy, and personal liberty. Not so much in the economic space. I think the point you make about Disraeli is a good one. There was a whole, I guess, strand. I forget the name they gave to it, but it was kind of like a paternalistic Toryism that
One,
went from Disraeli
one,
through to
one nation, conservative.
yeah, One Nation tour. Yeah, that's right. And Churchill was a champion of, I think, the widow's pension and national insurance. Joseph. There was a famous thing with Menzies and Joseph Lyons on national insurance and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, that was kind of the thinking then, and it all sort of changed in the 70s onwards. And
Mm.
I mean, that's sort of the nature of intellectual currents. I mean,
Yeah.
you have a dominant theory that lasts for a generation or two. It sort of gets replaced by something else thereafter. So, I, for one, am very much up for the debate.
Yeah, yeah. And when they did have it, it's not as though we're we're an island nation, but we're not an island intellectually. We can follow this stuff. And I just feel like in the Liberal Party, there's been a resistance to any reassessment of that. Not yourself and other probably younger people, but people from the Hawke, Keating, Howard type of era. They just viscerally push back against the JD Vances and the Trumps, and think to themselves, "Look, that's crazy. We've seen that show before. It didn't work." And hopefully, they're like the never Trumpers of National Review. They're not up for it, and they can't rethink it. And I don't know. I feel like there should at least be a much more fair debate about these issues. Like, Tony Abbott, who's a good guy and all the rest of it, but when he talks about China trade, he's sort of, and I've watched it closely, he's sort of all over the shop. At one level, he talks about it needs to be reciprocal, but then the agreement he signed didn't provide for a reciprocal trade. Other times he talks about reassessing it a bit, and then he blames Xi Jinping, but there's never any question about like fundamentally changing the nature of that agreement. And I just think that they're kind of tentative to move beyond simply, I don't know, complaining about the fact that it hasn't worked out for everyone, but haven't really kind of grasped the nettle and thought, okay, you know, free borders, open borders trade policy maybe isn't such a good idea from the go-get.
Yeah, in terms of I guess, the battle of ideas, I think that a lot of that's going to have to come from outside of the Liberal Party. Ultimately, you need political standard bearers to take forward a policy into the political arena. But I think that these ideas, for example, an alternative economic program, as far as I'm aware, hasn't been put forward on the centre right in terms of, well, okay, what would it look like? What would it look like if you were going to have this sort of economically nationalist agenda brought to Australia? And that's probably on us in sort of the broader centre right movement. I think one of the limitations of the centre right has been to put too much faith in the Liberal Party, and particularly the parliamentary wing of the Liberal Party. The reality is that, over the years, there's been some very good individual parliamentarians, but you're never going to get a large number that are going to be willing to engage in big public debates. And one of the reasons, to be honest, for that is the federal electorates are just so massive. There's like
Mm.
130,000 people per electorate. Um, a local member just does not have much time to think about this stuff. Sadly, I mean, by the time you're dealing with, very valid and important local constituent matters, you're in Canberra 26 weeks a year, engaging with legislation, and then you've got various stakeholders to engage with, plus your local branch and I guess the administrative wing of the Liberal Party. One of the realities I think of contemporary politics is modern parliamentarians don't have a lot of time to be thinking about this. So when you get into Parliament, you're sort of largely dependent upon the stock of intellectual capital you've built up when you get in there, because you're
Mm.
not going to be you don't have time to sit down and read books as much as you may have in the past, right? Um, so that's a limitation. So I think it's even more important for those of us who are not in Parliament to do some of the hard yards on that stuff.
Yeah, interesting. What I'm struck by is, and I understand a bit about the Liberal Party organisation like you do, is that while we say we want to represent the outer suburbs, on the ground, the party structures are so light on, and
Yep.
using that line from the Bible, where your treasure is, there your heart lies. Also, the members, the life members, the donors, the branches, the women's branches are all in the teal seats, and the seats that we say we are with in the outer suburbs, or that we share the same culture with, just don't have the same type of organization on the ground, and you can't win unless you do that and build it out, right?
Yeah, you're bang on with that. I mean, I've been very passionate about this for a long time. I lived in Melbourne for a number of years, and I was very passionate about trying to get the Liberal Party to move its headquarters out to Werribee, or at least to have an office or something out there. I mean, if they actually had a presence there, they probably would have won that by-election, by the way,
Mm.
which was like 6 months ago or so. But yeah, I'm very passionate about it, and I think you're right. You've got to go to where the people are. But the other point I think is important is, yeah, there's stated preferences and then there's revealed preferences. So you have people in the party who say, yeah, we want to win these, but do you actually want to do it? And I do. I mean, that's why I went out there and gave it a crack, and I intend on doing it again in some capacity. But yeah, I mean, my experience was, well, basically what the Liberal Party headquarters looks at is the top 20 seats in terms of what the margin is. Okay, those are
Mm.
the seats we're going to go for. I mean, it really is the horse and buggy of politics, right? I mean, the idea that, because it sort of suggests that a 5% seat in the inner city is the same as a 5% seat in the outer suburbs. It's just not true, right? The kind of people that you're talking to have a big impact on how difficult it is to win a vote. So my experience is there wasn't any real creative thinking. It was very, very old style thinking that has gone on. So, yeah, I mean, all I could say is I agree with you, and I'm very passionate about
Mm.
trying to get the infrastructure. And I'll make another point that I think is relevant, which is, like in my experience in the outer suburbs of Adelaide, the Liberal Party has been vanquished, right? So there's no state representation and no federal representation. So if you take the northern suburbs, there's two federal seats, Spence and Macon. I think there's probably 7 state seats that exist within those federal seats. I don't think any of them are Liberal. There's maybe one upper house Liberal member that's sort of I guess, the patron of northern suburbs. You have what's called paired senators, because a senator doesn't have a specific constituency, they're statewide, but they're paired with certain areas. So there'd be 1 or 2 senators that are paired with the North, but you compare that to Labor that would have probably 20 or 30 by the time you count local councillors, plus state, plus federal, plus Senate. They probably got 20 or 30 compared to our 2 or 3, right?
And
So
all the
if you
staff
don't,
and the resources that go with it to help sort of
it,
have
yep,
forward facing bases in those areas, yeah.
yeah. So when if you get invited to go to a school assembly, we often don't rock up.
Mm.
If you get invited to go to the Rotary Club, we often don't rock up, either because we're not interested or because we just don't have the manpower.
Mm.
Labor is always there. They're there at every single Hindu temple that's open, every single Hungry Jack's that's selling a new hamburger. They'll be there to cut the ribbon.
Mm,
And you can get cynical about it, right? But the point is, you've got to show people you care about them. You've got to dignify people with your time, not just expect them to vote for you in 3 years' time because you've got some great policies that you just can't wait to tell them about.
mm. Um, One of the differences in, at least in the States compared to Australia, is uh, the seats that Trump won were nevertheless white blue collar. Whereas I've heard some people say, yes, these outer suburbs voted for the voice, but it's very difficult for a conservative party to win over such a multicultural community. You know, just regardless of where you come from, it takes a couple of generations and for Irish to start voting for the Liberal Party, right? Or and from a different cultures to have so much of a stake that they have, uh, something that they want to defend and pass on. Do you think, is there a way through that, or a way to win let's call it a multi-ethnic conservative coalition in these places?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we just have to talk to them.
Hmm.
We don't even talk to these communities. We get upset about it. I have people telling me don't talk about cutting immigration levels because it upsets the multicultural groups. It's like, well, how do you know that? You haven't even talked to them.
Yeah.
I don't believe that's the case. Um,
Mm,
so I think the first step is to talk to people. So this is a broader discussion about. You'll hear people say, oh well, the Liberals basically need to be more left wing because young people don't vote for us, middle aged women don't vote for us, and migrant communities don't vote for us. Or
mm,
you're just going to be more like Labor. Okay. Now, no, the first step is actually talk to these people and communicate to them what you believe and why you think their lives will be better as a result.
mm,
Just start with that. We don't even do that at all. You don't have to pander to them.
mm,
I'm not, don't pretend to be something you're not. You're a liberal. Okay, what do I believe in? I believe Australia is a great country. I'm assuming you do too, because that's why you actually came here. Guess
mm,
what? Labor doesn't. Labor doesn't like Australia Day. We've got a prime minister who won't stand in front of the national flag. And by the way, Labor wanted to make you a second-class citizen through the voice to Parliament. Now, if you even just started with that, they're not even getting into the radical left-wing social views of Labor, because don't forget, a lot of migrant communities are relatively socially conservative.
mm,
But we never tell them Labor's views on gender ideology, for example. So my view is just, we don't know that migrant groups won't vote for us because we haven't even tried. So
mm.
that the first step is just being authentic, telling them what you believe, and then see what happens.
Do you think um, a call for drastic cuts to immigration could be sold to multicultural communities in the outer suburbs? Would that be a winning issue?
Yeah, for sure. There's no doubt about it. What a lot of the communities will get concerned about is you're not going to let their parents come or their family come because you've got a lot of chain migration that takes place. So from a but I think there's a big problem with the whole system, right? But
Mm,
purely from a political perspective, you do have to be careful with how you say that because
mm,
Labor will weaponize it and say you're not going to let grandma and grandpa come from India. Right? That's what they'll do. So
mm,
yes, you do have to be careful in how you talk about it. Um, but guess what? Migrants have children too. And they want their children to get ahead. They want their children to go to good school. They want their children to buy a house. And a lot of migrants that have come here, say 10 years ago, even they see that the place has gotten worse in 10 years'
mm,
time, right? You just look at the infrastructure, the congestion, all of the pressure on social services, and also the social division that's taken place where they go, well, hang on a minute. I've put in the hard yards. I've learned the local language. I've done my best to integrate into the community. And we have a new wave of migrants that don't seem interested in doing that. They seem to go to the front of the queue when it comes to social assistance. I go to the back of the queue. So I don't think that there is a inherent resistance among many migrant communities towards a cut to immigration.
mm,
But like I say, from a, I guess a public, a political perspective, you've got to be aware that Labor's going to ruthlessly attack you as, not wanting their family to come or whatever. But no, I think if on the, I guess what I'm saying is on the merits of the arguments themselves, it
mm,
is not a problem at all.
mm. Yeah, great. And obviously these things need to be sold, and you can do it have a great policy which is sold in a terrible way. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's my experience as well. I mean, I know the Chinese community quite well, and I don't know there's an appetite for mass immigration, on a large scale in those communities. I think there's a perception amongst some in who live in Hawthorne or in inner city Brisbane that and vote Liberal that's what those communities want. But I don't know whether that has actually been properly poll tested amongst other things, right? Yeah. Hey,
No.
on what one of the other issues that ha- has changed in the United States and is up for reassessment, I think, amongst the centre right across the Anglosphere, is in relation to foreign policy. I mean, Trump, despite a fair bit of erraticism, is much less inclined to get involved in far off conflicts and is very critical of the last 30 years, dismissive of, what went on in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and a whole lot of other places. I don't think on the right in Australia there's been the same type of reassessment about that. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the American and Australian situation is very different. America is the global superpower. Australia basically requires on a superpower to protect us. I mean, that's the reality of our security situation. We should do more as a nation to have our own sovereign capacity to manufacture and defend ourselves. I think in terms of, so I don't know how much debate there needs to be in Australia because what we do, yes, it can have an impact on global affairs, but to nowhere near the same extent as the United States. So I see it as a bit. I'm not. Whilst I agree in terms of the economic and social things that are happening in the US and the UK are clearly there's local adaptations that apply to Australia. I think foreign policy is a bit different. In terms of what Trump has been doing, I mean, the US. I mean, you probably know this more than me, but the US has a long history of going through bouts of isolationism, adventurism. This is not really anything fundamentally new for Americans. You can look at George Washington's his famous farewell address where he warns against foreign entanglements. Now, I don't think he was saying don't do anything internationally, but he was sort of warning, let's not spend all of our money and our time overseas. And I just think if you look at Trump's constituency, I mean, you can sort of see why if you're, a lower income working class American, you're the one that's basically being sent to fight in a lot of these wars. And if you're not convinced that they have value or that they're legitimately progressing the national interest, then at some point you're going to get a bit annoyed about it. So I think Trump has sort of tapped into a bit of that.
Yeah, I mean, George Washington, one of his other lines was he warned against passionate attachments to foreign conflicts. I feel like there's a bit of that in Australia. Not the merits. I mean, I have my views on different conflicts overseas, but I feel like Ukraine dominates the airwaves in
Mhm.
Australia here. Beyond, I think the actual people are notionally kind of in favour. Think Putin's a bully and what have, but I feel like w- we're more concerned about the ethnic composition, or at least some people are more concerned about the ethnic composition of Donetsk than they are of Doncaster. It's it's
Yeah.
it's not as it's not as actually as important because I often say to people, name 5 cities in the Ukraine, and usually they're sort of well, oh, I don't know, Kiev and this, that, and the other, and it's just it's become an abstraction rather than actually kind of a concrete issue. And I don't know, you've got to be delicate about these things because obviously people are being killed and this, that, and the other. But I feel like, as in the United States, there needs to be a little bit more kind of realism and restraint and thoughtfulness about not getting involved in everything around the world. And at the moment, I just don't think because we haven't really kind of gone through that same type of moment that Trump had, where he went down to the Citadel in South Carolina and said it was all just Iraq was a crazy, terrible thing, and everyone thought he'd, obviously lose in this heavily militarily, loving state, and he actually smashed it and won dramatically. I just feel like 70% of the Australian population probably also thinks the Iraq was a crazy idea and Afghanistan was a crazy idea. But I don't think the Liberal Party sort of legacy types do, or haven't really thought that in the same way. So I'm talking too much, but you get the point, right? It's an issue that we haven't. Yes, we follow America. Yes, we're dependent on it. We haven't really rethought through what we want to do in the world in a proper way.
Yeah, I guess my view on this is it gets back to the point that I think that very few things should be off limit from debate. And so it's sort of the case in Australia that if you take a view that's somewhat considered contrary to the establishment view, that you're siding with the enemy or something like that. So I sort of bemoan the fact that we don't actually have a proper debate in our country on a lot of these things. I mean, that also happened during COVID, right? I mean, if you were sort of saying, well, hang on a minute, maybe we shouldn't do what China's doing, shouldn't we sort of think about this? I experienced this at the IPA. We were the first organisation in the country to say don't do lockdowns, and that was on the 1st of April 2020. And we copped it big time, but we were right. So I just think that at the end of the day, well, I'm not a foreign policy expert, right? But I just think that fundamentally we need to be able to have debates as a society without people having their political careers ruined because they may have said something that's considered to be the wrong thing at a certain point in time.
Mm. I listened to another podcast, although I think more people tune into this actually, but the John Curtin Institute Curtin's Cast, because it's always worth listening to what thoughtful people on the left are saying, and that Kos Kamaris was, they were singing Andrew Hastie's praises when he went on there, and saying he's an example of someone who is thinking. And they described him as a red Tory, which perked my ears up. I mean, how do you describe yourself, like these days, like politically? I mean, are you all the way with has your thinking on? Would you describe yourself as a red Tory?
Yeah, you're going to laugh at this, but I describe myself as an Australian. I think there is a certain Australian way of life that is unique and has unique aspects. I don't think left or right really mean anything anymore politically. I'm very sympathetic to a lot of the sort of the red Tory. I mean, the sort of stuff that Philip Blond did in the UK. I mean, I think a lot of his policy ideas, it was like about using the post office to be, to be a central hub. I don't know whether his policy ideas, but his conceptualization, I think, was fair. Sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah, I mean, sometimes I had him on the podcast. He's an interesting guy. Sometimes it's a bit woolly communitarian, which and it's hard to work out what you want, and it's different to the kind of what I describe as the new right in the United States, which is much more trade, foreign policy, immigration. These are core issues rather than, let's rejuvenate the post office and make it into a hub for the community type of thing. So, but yeah, I mean, but he does, I think I'm talking too much, but he does recognize that the Conservative Party of the UK has become a liberal party, and it's forgotten conservative tradition, which is not just social conservatives. It's a much broader, thoughtful way of thinking about what a nation should be and how it should interact, the duty it owes to its citizens, and how it should interact with the world as well. And I just feel like it's such a rich tradition, but it's sort of not understood properly in Australia because we're meant to be all, like I said, we're all classical liberals now or something.
Yeah, and I think Peter Hitchens has made a similar point about the UK. He's been pretty critical of Thatcher's time as PM, and I think he's sort of diminishing just how bad the UK was in the 1970s and that something really needed to change. But he sort of argues that, some of this, when economic liberalism gets put in front of everything else, it acts as a solvent on social institutions, which is there's probably truth to that. I don't think it's the whole story. I think one of the big things for the centre-right to talk about, which we're finally talking about a little bit, which is the family. And the fact that these days, mum and dad both have to work to pay these obscenely high mortgages, which are in part caused by this mass migration program. And getting around and getting commuting and getting the kids to school. I mean, life has become very difficult, and then that's where the work from home policy sort of was sort of a bit of a tin ear kind of thing. Although I think it was sort of overstated in terms of the negative impact. I don't think it was the only thing, right? People always look for a silver bullet and they look for a scapegoat, but in my experience, it was really a problem for us in the election. Um, but I think you look at things like, I'll just give you an example. I was looking at this the other day. So federally, there's about $16 billion a year spent on childcare subsidies. That goes to about 1 million eligible families. So that's $16,000 per year, right, per family on childcare subsidy. But the family doesn't get the 16 grand, right? The 16 grand is basically a transfer from the government via the family to the childcare facilitators. Now, surely a better use of that money is to, if we think that money should be provided from the federal government, and we can have that debate, but if we think we're going to keep that money, wouldn't you just provide that money directly to the family to support the raising of their children in a way that they see fit, or at least have that debate? And there'll be some who say, well, that's not a liberal policy. We shouldn't be doing that. And it's like, yeah, but what we're doing now isn't liberal either. And we are supporting it. Like, the Liberal Party supports the status quo with childcare. So if you're going to have a big government, and I think we should have a debate about the size of government and how much spending and so forth. But if we say, okay, we take it as is, isn't our job then to actually channel and leverage those resources and power from government to try to achieve social outcomes that we think are good? That's what I think. So,
yeah, I mean, there are so many perverse incentives and waste in the current system, right? And like you say, it just puts so much strain on families. You've got to effectively have a dual income to own a property in any decent suburb. And some on the right would sort of sniff at that and go, oh, just live out miles out. But you don't get as good schools out there. You have a much longer commute. The jobs, if you're trying to work your way up professionally, tend to be often in the cities. So you have to. Sometimes I feel like the rhetoric is clueless and cruel, because it says just pull your socks up, and it was hard in my day, and while meanwhile these people who did buy these houses have this tax-free magical asset gain, and everyone else has to sort of slave away with repressive sort of income tax rates. The whole kind of policy framework is it's I like to just cite that line from David Attenborough when he talks about the Mariana Trench. Even down here life survives. It's so tough, and things keep ticking along, but it shouldn't be that hard. We should be living in the people used to be able to support quite large families with one income and live in reasonable sort of housing accommodation with famous, quarter-acre block. I mean, that just seems beyond the realms of the imagination of a young person these days. And that was but it wasn't. It used to happen. So yeah, on young people, what is it to them in the end?
Just say that again. On young people, I didn't catch the last part of what you said. Sorry.
What's the best pitch to them?
Well, I think with young people, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, if we're talking as a Liberal Party, again, it gets back to the point I'm making about migrant communities. You've got to be yourself. Like, actually, so much of it is dumbed down. Like, we treat young people as if they're idiots. Like, oh, you want free stuff? Here's some free stuff. Of course, they're going to take the money and run. Here's 20%. I would have taken it when I paid off my HECS, but sure, you're going to give me 20% off. Great. But we don't treat young people like adults. That's the fundamental problem. And yes, I think that there are big problems with our education system, and I don't think it's as good as it used to be. But I don't think the typical young person is silly. Right? They've shown that they have the capacity to engage in pretty sophisticated long-form discussions. Joe Rogan podcast is an exemplar of dominated largely by young men who watch it. So they're hungry for more meaning in their lives, and so there's that. I also think that there's a big pushback against political correctness. and certainly a rebellion against the political establishment. Our exit poll that we did alongside Advance Australia for the Voice to Parliament referendum found that 54% of men aged 18 to 24 voted no to the Voice to Parliament, just to give you one example. So I think there's an element there of political correctness. And then the other thing I think is authenticity, being authentic with everyone, but younger people in particular, because they've spent all their lives inundated with basically spin. You know, schools spin them a yarn on, our country and indigenous stuff and climate change, and then you have all this corporate stuff that comes in. And then they had sort of a refuge on social media, and the boomers took over Facebook, so they don't use Facebook anymore because then that became a monetized platform for advertising. So that's why they use TikTok, because TikTok can't be monetized in the same way that the other platforms can. Now, I don't really like TikTok. I think it's a very bad. I think social media in general is quite bad, but there's a reason why it's used by younger people. So they're looking for the real deal. They know they don't get it from the main institutions of society, and just another video about avocados. I'm sure that's the solution to talking to young people, right? But no, they want to engage in these serious things as well, just as much as anyone else does.
Yeah, and I actually think there's a real clash between political parties that instinctively want to play it safe and have these set pieces, and the way the discussion is just has to happen, which is much more like a mosh pit, and everyone's just going through it. And you can prevail, provided, like you said, you're authentic and you've got a clearer message and a distinctive message. But you're not going to kind of sell a 1980s type political slogan and have them repeat it like the way that some political consultants sort of, like to think. Hey, mate, I've taken up a fair bit of your time, and I've probably talked too much. But I really appreciate what you do, because you're a forthright, thoughtful guy, and you're willing to get out there and actually go where the Liberal Party needs to win. And look forward to chatting with you further. And good luck to you.
No worries, thanks. And again, thanks for what you do. I think I really do think that there needs to be more voices on the centre right. So the more debates and discussions we can have, it's only going to be to our favour.
Sounds good. Leave it to it. Take it easy. Bye.